Welcome to Cafe Stories. I'm Alfie, your host for today's mystery. We're joining the beloved Miss Jane Marple in The House of Three Widows. This story will captivate you as a seemingly simple inheritance dispute reveals a web of jealousy, secrets, and betrayal spanning over 4 decades. Before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from today. Let me know in the comments. Now settle into your favourite armchair, perhaps with a cup of tea, and prepare to be transported to the remote village of Thornwick, where the seemingly harmless Miss Marple uncovers the darkest of family secrets. Miss Marple and the House of Three Widows. Chapter 1. An Invitation to Hillcrest. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, her nimble fingers busy with her knitting as she enjoyed the last of the day's sunshine. The roses were particularly fine this year, and she had been engaged in the pleasant occupation of dead-heading the spent blooms when the afternoon post had arrived. Now, with her gardening completed, she was examining the letter that had arrived from her old friend, Mrs. Dolores Bantry. It was written in Dolores's characteristic flowing hand, not quite as steady as it once had been, but still instantly recognizable. "Most curious circumstances," she read. "I am visiting my cousin in Thornwick, such a remote place, quite in the mountains, and there is a situation which I believe would interest you greatly. 3 sisters living in a grand old house, all widows if you can imagine, and now the youngest has died most suddenly." Miss Marple's faded blue eyes narrowed slightly as she continued reading. "Nobody speaks of anything untoward, of course, but there are whispers. There always are in these small villages, as you well know. The remaining sisters are quite the characters. Agatha, the eldest, is formidable, rather like old Lady Harrington, who used to terrify the village children. The middle one, Beatrice, follows her about like a shadow. They say the dead sister, Cecilia was her name, was the only one with any spirit." Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully as she considered the letter. "I would be so pleased if you could visit while I am still here. Thornwick has a charming little inn, the Golden Pheasant, where you would be most comfortable. The house, Hillcrest Manor they call it, quite overlooks the village. Do say you'll come. I have a feeling there is something here that requires your particular gift for observation." A slight smile touched Miss Marple's thin lips. Dolores had always been one for dramatic statements, even in their school days. Yet her friend was not unintelligent, and if she sensed something amiss. 3 days later, Miss Marple descended from the local train at the small Thornwick station. It had been a tiring journey, with 2 changes and a final stretch on a branch line that seemed to stop at every conceivable hamlet. The station was little more than a platform with a small waiting room, and for a moment Miss Marple wondered if she had been forgotten. "Miss Marple? I am Dr. Henderson." She turned to find a middle-aged man with greying hair and a weathered face approaching her. He had the look of a country doctor, observant eyes that missed little, and a manner that combined authority with approachability. "Mrs. Bantry sends her apologies. She has been detained at Hillcrest Manor and asked if I might collect you. I was coming to the station in any case." "How very kind," said Miss Marple, allowing him to take her modest suitcase. "It is most accommodating of you, Dr. Henderson." As they walked toward his car, she noticed a slight tension in his manner. It was nothing overt, but Miss Marple had spent a lifetime observing the small betrayals of human behaviour. "You are the local physician here in Thornwick?" she inquired mildly. "For 25 years now," he confirmed, helping her into the passenger seat. "One gets to know everyone in a place this size, every ailment, every family secret." There was something in his tone that caught Miss Marple's attention. She waited, knowing from experience that silence often encouraged revelation more effectively than questions. "I understand you're here to visit Mrs. Bantry," he continued after a moment, starting the car. "She's staying with the Thorndikes up at Hillcrest." "Yes, Dolores mentioned 3 sisters in her letter, though I understand one has recently passed away." The doctor's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel. "Cecilia Thorndyke, yes, most unfortunate." "Was she ill for long?" asked Miss Marple, in the gentle, slightly vague manner that so often led people to underestimate her. "That's just it," said Dr. Henderson, and then seemed to check himself. "A sudden illness, nothing that should have been... Well, these things happen as we age." They were passing through the village now, a picturesque collection of stone cottages clustering around a small green and an ancient church. Beyond, on a hill that commanded views across the valley, stood a large Victorian house, its grey stone facade softened by climbing roses and wisteria. "Hillcrest Manor," said the doctor, following her gaze. "The Thorndyke sisters have lived there all their lives. Their father built it in more prosperous times." "How sad that they should lose one of their number," observed Miss Marple. "Yes," said Dr. Henderson shortly. After a moment he added, "Mrs. Bantry mentioned you have some experience with unusual circumstances." "Oh dear, I am afraid Dolores exaggerates," Miss Marple replied, looking faintly embarrassed. "One does see a surprising amount of human nature in village life. People are much the same everywhere, I find." The doctor glanced at her with an expression that suggested he was reassessing his initial impression. "Perhaps they are, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "And perhaps that's precisely what troubles me about this situation." As they approached the inn, Miss Marple gazed up at the distant house on the hill. Something in the doctor's manner, in the atmosphere of the village itself, suggested disquiet beneath the peaceful surface. The 3 widows of Hillcrest Manor, now only 2, seemed to cast a long shadow over Thornwick. Miss Marple settled her hat more firmly and prepared to meet her old friend, her mind already sifting through the subtle undercurrents she had detected. Chapter 2. The 3 Sisters. Miss Marple had scarcely settled into her comfortable room at the Golden Pheasant when Mrs. Bantry arrived in a flurry of excitement. Despite the passing years, Dolores Bantry maintained the energetic manner that had characterized her since youth, though her once dark hair was now completely silver. "Jane, how wonderful to see you!" she exclaimed, embracing her old friend. "I was detained at Hillcrest. Such a to-do about the will, or rather the absence of one." "No will has been found?" inquired Miss Marple, offering Mrs. Bantry a seat by the window overlooking the village green. "None that anyone can locate. Agatha, that's the eldest, insists Cecilia must have left one, but the solicitor has been through everything twice over." Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice. "The atmosphere up there is positively stifling. I'm convinced there's more to Cecilia's death than meets the eye." Miss Marple's needles began their rhythmic clicking as she took up her knitting. Dr. Henderson seemed somewhat concerned when he collected me from the station. "Did he indeed?" Mrs. Bantry looked thoughtful. "He attended Cecilia at the end, you know. Cardiac failure was the official verdict, but I've noticed he's been rather attentive to Beatrice lately. That's the middle sister." The following morning dawned bright and clear. After a simple breakfast, Miss Marple set out for Hillcrest Manor, having accepted an invitation to tea. The walk was uphill but not unpleasant, offering splendid views of the surrounding countryside. As she approached the house, she noted how the Victorian architecture presented a somewhat forbidding aspect despite the climbing roses that softened its grey stone walls. The door was opened by a thin, elderly maid with watchful eyes who led Miss Marple through a dimly lit hallway into a drawing-room where the remaining Thorndyke sisters awaited. "Miss Marple, "How good of you to visit us in our time of sorrow," said Agatha Thorndyke, rising from her chair by the fireplace. Miss Marple was immediately struck by the woman's commanding presence. Tall and straight-backed despite her years, with silver hair pulled into a severe bun, Agatha Thorndyke possessed the unmistakable air of one accustomed to authority. Her black mourning dress was impeccably tailored, her only ornament a cameo brooch at her throat. "Mrs. Bantry has spoken so highly of you," Agatha continued, gesturing to a chair. "And this is my sister, Beatrice." The contrast between the sisters was immediately apparent. Where Agatha was commanding, Beatrice appeared diminished, as though existing in her sister's shadow. Smaller and slighter, with a perpetually anxious expression, she nodded to Miss Marple with a hesitant smile. "How do you do?" she said in a soft voice. "I hope you'll forgive our reduced circumstances. Since Cecilia's passing, things have been rather unsettled." "Naturally," murmured Miss Marple sympathetically. "It is always difficult to lose a loved one, especially so suddenly." A silence fell, laden with unspoken tensions. The maid brought in tea, and Miss Marple observed how Beatrice's hands trembled slightly as she poured. "You must tell us about yourself, Miss Marple," said Agatha, her tone making it more command than request. "Dolores mentioned you reside in St. Mary Mead. Such a charming village, I understand." "Oh yes, though I dare say not nearly as picturesque as Thornwick," replied Miss Marple, with gentle self-deprecation. "One does see all manner of human nature in village life, however. People are remarkably similar wherever one goes." "Indeed," said Agatha, with the faintest hint of condescension. "I find mountain communities quite distinct from those in more accessible locations. We keep to ourselves here at Hillcrest." "Cecilia didn't," said Beatrice suddenly, then looked alarmed at her own boldness. Agatha's expression hardened momentarily. "My younger sister was of a different temperament, more impulsive." "We were all different, really," Beatrice continued, gaining courage. "Though we shared this house all our lives, would you care to see Cecilia's portrait, Miss Marple? It was painted just last year." The portrait hung in the library, a room lined with leather-bound volumes and smelling pleasantly of beeswax and old paper. The painting revealed a woman perhaps a decade younger than her sisters, with a vivacious expression and a secretive smile that suggested hidden depths. Unlike the austere furnishings of the drawing-room, Cecilia's portrait conveyed warmth and a certain defiance. "She was always the pretty one," said Beatrice softly, "even as a girl." "All three of you must have been quite striking in your youth," observed Miss Marple. A smile flickered across Beatrice's face. "There was a time but that was many years ago, before we married." "Did your husbands reside here at Hillcrest?" asked Miss Marple, innocently. "Certainly not," said Agatha, who had followed them into the library. "We each married and left home, as was proper. It was only after we were widowed that we returned to the family house." "How fortunate you had one another for companionship," said Miss Marple. "Yes, wasn't it?" said Beatrice with an inflection that suggested the opposite. As they returned to the drawing-room, Miss Marple noticed a photograph on a side table. 3 young women in the fashion of the early 1900s, standing with a handsome, dark-haired man. "Oh, that was taken before any of us were married," said Beatrice, following her gaze. "Edward Blackwood, he was quite the eligible bachelor in those days." "Beatrice, I hardly think Miss Marple is interested in ancient history," Agatha cut in sharply. "The gardener has been asking about the roses, and I believe you wished to speak with him." The dismissal was thinly veiled, and Beatrice obediently excused herself. Once she had gone, Agatha's manner became marginally more relaxed. "You must forgive my sister. Cecilia's death has affected her deeply. They were always close, despite their differences." "It is only natural," said Miss Marple. Mr. Blackwood in the photograph? Was he a family friend? Something flickered in Agatha Thorndyke's eyes, a hardness that belied her polite smile. A mere acquaintance from many years ago. None of us has heard from him in decades. As Miss Marple departed Hillcrest Manor, an hour later, she found herself reflecting on the strange atmosphere of the house, the tensions beneath the surface, the carefully maintained facade of propriety, and most particularly, the way both sisters had reacted to the mention of Edward Blackwood. There was a story there, she felt certain, one that perhaps held the key to understanding the present circumstances. Chapter 3. Whispers from the Village. The following morning, Miss Marple decided to acquaint herself with the village of Thornwick. Such explorations, she had found, often yielded the most valuable insights. Small communities like St. Mary Mead invariably harboured a wealth of information beneath their tranquil surfaces. She began at the village shop, a quaint establishment that served as both post office and general store. A bell tinkled pleasantly as she entered, and the shopkeeper, a rosy-cheeked woman of middle years, looked up with friendly curiosity. "Good morning," said Miss Marple. "I wonder if you might have any lavender soap? I find I've neglected to pack mine." "Of course, madam," the woman replied, reaching beneath the counter. "You're staying at the Pheasant, aren't you? Mrs. Bantry's friend from, was it St. Mary Mead?" "Why, yes," said Miss Marple, appearing pleasantly surprised. News travels quickly in Thornwick. The shopkeeper, who introduced herself as Mrs. Pringle, smiled knowingly. "Not much happens here that isn't known by tea time, especially with visitors to Hillcrest. I understand you called on the Thorndyke sisters yesterday." "Yes, such a magnificent house," Miss Marple remarked, her tone one of innocent admiration, though tinged with sadness, of course, after their recent loss. Mrs. Pringle's expression became more guarded. "A terrible shock, Miss Thorndyke, passing so sudden-like. She was the youngest, you know, and always seemed the most robust of the three." "Indeed? I gathered she was of a somewhat different temperament than her sisters." "Oh my, yes," Mrs. Pringle leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "Much more spirited. Used to go to London regularly, even in recent years. Always brought back the most elegant things, not that she ever said much about her trips." "How interesting," murmured Miss Marple. "Were her sisters not similarly inclined to travel?" "Miss Agatha?" "Hardly," Mrs. Pringle sniffed. "Hasn't left Thornwick in 20 years, I shouldn't think. And Miss Beatrice follows her about like a lamb." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another customer, but not before Mrs. Pringle mentioned that the church would be open that morning, should Miss Marple wish to visit. The church of St. Michael's was small but beautifully maintained, with Norman architecture and stained glass windows that cast jewelled patterns across the stone floor. Miss Marple had just finished admiring a particularly fine example when she became aware of another presence. "It's 14th century," said a gentle voice behind her. "The glass, I mean." She turned to find a tall, thin man in clerical attire regarding her with a kind expression. "Reverend Thomas Hadley," he introduced himself. "You must be Miss Marple. Mrs. Bantry mentioned you might visit our little church." "How kind of her," said Miss Marple. "You have a charming village, Reverend Hadley." "Thank you. We're rather fond of it, despite, or perhaps because of, its isolation." He gestured toward a memorial plaque. "The Thorndykes have been prominent parishioners for generations. A great loss, the passing of Miss Cecilia." "I understand it was quite unexpected," ventured Miss Marple. The vicar's expression became thoughtful. "Yes, though perhaps not entirely surprising to those who knew her well, Cecilia Thorndyke lived with certain pressures." "Family pressures, you mean?" "Thornwick can be a confining place for a spirit like hers," he replied diplomatically. "My wife often said Cecilia seemed to have one foot in our world and one somewhere else entirely. Perhaps you'd care to take tea with us. Martha would be delighted to make your acquaintance." The vicarage was a modest cottage adjacent to the church, filled with books and simple, well-loved furniture. Mrs. Hadley proved to be a cheerful, practical woman who served tea and homemade scones with evident pleasure in receiving a visitor. "I was just telling Miss Marple about the Thorndykes," the vicar explained. "Ah," said Mrs. Hadley, her expression sobering. "A difficult situation. Were you acquainted with Miss Cecilia by any chance?" "I'm afraid not," replied Miss Marple. "Though I've met her sisters now, there seems to have been quite a contrast between them." "Like chalk and cheese," agreed Mrs. Hadley, "especially in recent months. There was a visitor, you know, not long before she died, a stranger to the village, a well-dressed woman who called at Hillcrest and left rather abruptly. The very next day, according to Agnes, she helps with the cleaning there. Miss Cecilia and Miss Agatha had the most dreadful argument." "Martha," her husband cautioned gently. "Well, it's hardly a secret, Thomas. The whole village heard about it from Agnes, who said they were shouting so loudly she could hear them from the downstairs pantry. Something about bringing shame on the family name and are opening old wounds." "Did Agnes happen to mention what precisely the disagreement concerned?" asked Miss Marple. "Unfortunately not," said Mrs. Hadley, "though she did say that afterward Miss Cecilia locked herself in her room for hours, and the very next day she sent for Mr. Graves." "The solicitor," explained Reverend Hadley, seeing Miss Marple's questioning look, "who handles the Thorndyke affairs." As Miss Marple walked back to the inn later that afternoon, she found herself comparing the situation to one she had encountered in St. Mary Mead some years before. Old Mrs. Ellington had kept a secret for decades, a secret that had led to 3 broken engagements, and ultimately a death that many had considered natural until certain facts came to light. Miss Marple, just the person. She looked up to find Dr. Henderson approaching from the direction of Hillcrest Manor. "I've just been attending Miss Beatrice," he explained. "She's been rather unwell since her sister's passing. Anxiety, primarily, though there may be an underlying cardiac issue that bears watching." "How distressing," said Miss Marple. "I found her seemed somewhat overwrought during my visit." "Indeed?" The doctor hesitated. "Miss Marple, I understand from Mrs. Bantry that you have some experience with unusual circumstances. I wonder if I might speak frankly." "Of course, Doctor." "Cecilia Thorndyke's death troubles me," he said, lowering his voice, though there was no one nearby. "The symptoms were consistent with heart failure, yes, but there was a suddenness that, well, I've been practicing medicine for many years, and sometimes one develops intuitions." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "There's to be a gathering at Hillcrest tomorrow," he continued. "Mr. Graves is arriving from London regarding the will. It appears there have been some developments. Mrs. Bantry suggested you might wish to accompany her." "That would be most interesting," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. As the doctor took his leave, Miss Marple continued toward the inn, her mind busy with the various fragments of information she had gathered. The mysterious visitor, the argument between the sisters, the hasty summoning of the solicitor, all suggested that Cecilia Thorndyke had indeed been harbouring some secret. And secrets, as Miss Marple well knew, could be deadly when suddenly exposed to light. Chapter 4. The Hidden Will. The gathering at Hillcrest the following afternoon promised to be a tense affair. Miss Marple arrived with Mrs. Bantry shortly before 3 o'clock to find the drawing-room already occupied by Agatha Thorndyke, who sat rigidly in her customary chair by the fireplace. "Mrs. Bantry," Miss Marple?" she acknowledged with a curt nod. "Mr. Graves has been delayed by some trouble on the railway. Beatrice is resting, but will join us when he arrives." "I do hope she's feeling better," said Miss Marple. "Dr. Henderson mentioned she had been unwell." "My sister has always been delicate," replied Agatha dismissively. "The slightest upset affects her nerves." "And there have been many upsets of late," observed Mrs. Bantry. "This business with Cecilia's will, or lack thereof, must be quite distressing." "Indeed," said Agatha. Her thin fingers gripped the arms of her chair. "Though I cannot imagine what possessed Cecilia to revise her arrangements, our previous understanding was perfectly clear." "Previous understanding?" inquired Miss Marple gently. "A simple agreement made some years ago. As none of us had children, we each pledged to leave our portions to the surviving sisters." She frowned. "But Cecilia always was unpredictable. If she did make changes, they will no doubt be as impulsive as she was." At that moment, the elderly maid appeared to announce Mr. Graves's arrival. The solicitor was a small, precise man with gold-rimmed spectacles and a manner that suggested he was more comfortable with documents than with people. "Miss Thorndyke," he greeted Agatha with a small bow. "Ladies, I apologize for the delay." "Shall I fetch Miss Beatrice?" asked the maid. "Yes, Martha. And some tea, if you please." Agatha gestured for Mr. Graves to take a seat. "I understand you've been unable to locate Cecilia's most recent will." The solicitor placed his briefcase on a side table and extracted a folder. "That is correct. I have only the document executed 3 years ago, leaving her estate to you and Miss Beatrice in equal shares. However, as I explained in my letter, Miss Cecilia definitely called upon me 6 weeks ago to discuss revisions." "But nothing was finalized," pressed Agatha. "She said she would send the completed document by post within the week." Mr. Graves adjusted his spectacles. "I received nothing, despite sending 2 subsequent reminders." Beatrice entered quietly, looking pale and drawn in her black dress. She took a seat near the window, slightly apart from the others. "As things stand," continued Mr. Graves, "we must proceed with the earlier will unless new documentation can be found. I've taken the liberty of searching Miss Cecilia's study with Martha's assistance, but without success." "Perhaps she changed her mind," suggested Agatha, though her tone lacked conviction. "That would be most uncharacteristic," said Mr. Graves. "Miss Cecilia was most emphatic about her intentions." "Did she happen to mention the nature of these revisions?" asked Miss Marple innocently. Mr. Graves hesitated. "I am not at liberty to discuss the specific contents of our conversation. Professional confidence, you understand. However, I can say that she indicated her wishes had altered significantly in recent months. Tea was brought in, and the conversation turned to procedural matters of the estate. Miss Marple, observing the proceedings, noticed how Beatrice seemed increasingly distracted, her gaze frequently drifting toward the door as though expecting, or perhaps dreading, someone's arrival. When the meeting concluded an hour later, Agatha suggested that Mrs. Bantry might like to see the gardens, which were particularly fine this time of year. As they departed, Beatrice unexpectedly approached Miss Marple. "I wonder if you might care to see some of my sister's collections," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Cecilia had quite an eye for beautiful objects. Miss Marple accepted readily, and Beatrice led her through the corridor to a small sitting room that obviously had belonged to the youngest Thorndyke. Unlike the formal drawing room, this space reflected a more vibrant personality: comfortable chairs, colourful cushions, and shelves lined with ornate music boxes of various sizes and designs. "How charming!" exclaimed Miss Marple, examining a particularly elaborate example with gilt edges. "Such exquisite craftsmanship! Cecilia began collecting them after her husband died. explained Beatrice, each one from somewhere she had visited. She loved music, you see. It was one of many things that set her apart from Agatha and me. They're quite remarkable, said Miss Marple, noting how some appeared antique, while others were more modern. Did she have a favourite? Beatrice reached for a medium-sized box of rosewood decorated with mother-of-pearl inlay. This one played a waltz she particularly loved. Her explanation was cut short by a sudden fit of coughing that left her gasping for breath. Miss Marple helped her to a chair, concerned by her pallor. "Shall I call for assistance?" No, Beatrice insisted, though her voice was faint. "It will pass. It always does." By the time they rejoined the others for dinner, Beatrice appeared to have recovered, though she ate very little. The conversation remained largely superficial until coffee was served, when Beatrice suddenly slumped forward in her chair, her cup clattering to the floor. "Beatrice!" Agatha's voice was sharp with alarm as Dr. Henderson, who had been invited to dine, moved swiftly to examine the stricken woman. "She needs to be taken to her room immediately," he instructed. "This is more serious than her usual attacks." In the commotion that followed, Miss Marple found herself offering to assist. "I have some experience in nursing," she explained. "Perhaps I might sit with her while you fetch what you need, Doctor?" With Beatrice settled in her bed, breathing laboriously despite the doctor's ministrations, Miss Marple stationed herself by the bedside. The house had grown silent, the other guests having departed given the circumstances. From somewhere in the corridor she heard the sound of a door quietly opening and closing, followed by soft footsteps. Curious, Miss Marple stepped into the hallway. At the far end, she glimpsed Agatha's tall figure disappearing into what she recognized as Cecilia's sitting room. Following discreetly, she paused outside the door, which had been left ajar. Within, she could see Agatha methodically examining the collection of music boxes, opening each one, running her fingers along the bases and edges as though searching for something. Miss Marple retreated silently to Beatrice's room, her mind working through the implications of what she had witnessed. An hour later, as the household finally settled for the night, she returned to her room at the inn, still puzzling over the day's events. It was well past midnight when she was awakened by what seemed to be music, a faint, tinkling melody that she couldn't immediately place. Sitting up in bed, Miss Marple realized that the sound wasn't in her room at all, but a memory triggered by the day's events. The waltz from Cecilia's favourite music box. Where had she heard it before? Chapter 5. The Melody Reveals. Miss Marple awoke early the following morning, the half-remembered melody still lingering in her mind. After a light breakfast, she set out for Hillcrest Manor, ostensibly to inquire after Miss Beatrice's health, but with another purpose forming in her methodical mind. The elderly maid, Martha, answered the door, her expression harried. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm afraid this isn't a convenient time. Dr. Henderson has been with Miss Beatrice since dawn, and Miss Agatha is quite beside herself." "I'm so very sorry to hear that," said Miss Marple, with genuine concern. "Is there anything I might do to help? I have some experience in sick rooms." Martha hesitated, then relented. "Well, Miss Agatha is with the doctor now, and there's no one to prepare fresh tea, if you wouldn't mind sitting with Miss Beatrice for a few minutes." The sick room was dimly lit, heavy curtains drawn against the morning light. Beatrice lay pale against the pillows, her breathing shallow but regular. She appeared to be sleeping, though not peacefully. Miss Marple took a seat beside the bed, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked. After several minutes, Beatrice's eyelids fluttered open. She gazed at Miss Marple with momentary confusion before recognition dawned. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "how kind of you to come." Not at all, my dear. I was concerned after your turn last night. Beatrice attempted a weak smile. It seems I am following in Cecilia's footsteps sooner than expected. Now you mustn't talk that way, admonished Miss Marple gently. Dr. Henderson is doing everything possible. Yes, murmured Beatrice, though some conditions are beyond medical remedy. Her gaze drifted toward the window. Miss Marple, might I ask you something? Of course. If you knew something terrible, would you tell, even if it meant destroying what little peace remained? Before Miss Marple could respond, the door opened and Agatha entered, followed by Dr. Henderson. Seeing Miss Marple, Agatha's expression hardened. I wasn't aware we had visitors, she said coldly. Martha asked me to sit with your sister while she prepared tea, explained Miss Marple, gathering her knitting. I'll leave you now. No, please stay, said Beatrice unexpectedly, her voice stronger. I would like to speak with Miss Marple privately when the doctor has finished. Agatha's mouth tightened, but she did not object further. After Dr. Henderson had completed his examination and provided fresh medication, he drew Miss Marple aside. Her condition is worsening, he murmured. The symptoms are remarkably similar to her sister's final illness, though progressing more slowly. I've sent for a specialist from London, but... His meaning was clear. When he and Agatha had gone, Miss Marple returned to Beatrice's bedside. You wish to speak with me? Beatrice glanced anxiously at the door. Cecilia's music box, the rosewood one I showed you. She and Edward, that was their song. Edward Blackwood? Prompted Miss Marple when Beatrice fell silent. Yes. We all loved him once, you know. All three sisters competing for the same man. A bitter smile touched her lips. Agatha was the eldest and most accomplished. I was the sensible one. But Cecilia... Cecilia had a fire in her that neither of us possessed. Edward recognized it immediately. Yet none of you married him, observed Miss Marple. There was an incident, a scandal that our father couldn't abide. Edward left Thornwick, and we all made suitable marriages elsewhere. Beatrice's voice grew fainter, but Cecilia never forgot, and neither did Agatha. She closed her eyes, exhaustion evident in her face. The music box. You must... Her voice trailed off as she drifted into sleep or unconsciousness. Miss Marple sat with her a while longer, then quietly left the room. Rather than heading downstairs, however, she made her way to Cecilia's sitting room. The door was unlocked, the room undisturbed since her previous visit. The rosewood music box sat among its companions on the shelf. Miss Marple took it down carefully, examining its elegant craftsmanship. When she opened the lid, a waltz began to play, the same melody that had echoed in her memory during the night. Looking more closely at the box, Miss Marple noticed something unusual about its construction. The interior compartment seemed shallower than the exterior dimensions would suggest. Her fingers, sensitive from years of needlework, detected a slight irregularity in the wooden base. With careful pressure, a hidden panel slid aside, revealing a folded document. Miss Marple had just withdrawn it when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Quickly replacing the music box, she turned toward the bookshelf as Beatrice entered, leaning heavily on a walking stick. "You found it," said Beatrice, her voice barely audible. "I thought you might." "You should be resting," said Miss Marple with concern. "There isn't time for rest." Beatrice made her way to a chair. "Agatha has gone to the village. We have perhaps 15 minutes. Miss Marple hesitated only briefly before retrieving the document. "Is this what I think it is?" "Cecilia's will, the revised version she prepared after the visitor came." Beatrice's hands trembled. "Open it, please. I need to know if she did as she promised." The document was indeed a legal will, properly executed and witnessed. Miss Marple scanned its contents, her expression remaining carefully neutral despite her surprise at the primary beneficiary's name, Eleanor Blackwood. "Did you know of this Eleanor?" she asked Beatrice. "I suspected. The resemblance was unmistakable when she came. Those same eyes." Beatrice shook her head slowly. "Cecilia finally told me the truth after all these years. Eleanor is Edward's daughter." "And Cecilia's?" prompted Miss Marple gently. "Yes. Born in secret after he left Thornwick, given up for adoption but never forgotten. She found Cecilia somehow, a letter from a solicitor, I believe, after all these years." A fit of coughing interrupted her explanation. "You must return to bed," insisted Miss Marple. "Shall I replace the will?" "No," said Beatrice firmly, regaining her breath. "Keep it safe. Mr. Graves must see it. Cecilia wanted Eleanor to have everything. It was her way of making amends." "And you believe this is why—" Before Miss Marple could complete her question, they heard the front door open downstairs and Agatha's voice issuing instructions to Martha. Beatrice clutched Miss Marple's hand. "Please, help me back to my room. She mustn't find us here together." By the time Agatha climbed the stairs, Miss Marple had settled Beatrice back in bed and concealed the will in her knitting bag. She made her excuses shortly thereafter, promising to return the following day. That afternoon, as the inn prepared for dinner service, word arrived that Mr. Graves would be returning to Hillcrest the next morning. Mrs. Bantry, joining Miss Marple for tea in the parlour, was full of the latest development. "An urgent telephone call from London, I understand," she reported. "Something about Cecilia's estate. The whole village is talking of nothing else." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I imagine they will have much more to discuss tomorrow." Chapter 6. The Daughter's Arrival. The reading of Cecilia Thorndyke's newly discovered will took place in the drawing-room at Hillcrest the following morning. Miss Marple attended at Beatrice's specific request, though Agatha had made her displeasure at the arrangement quite clear. "A family matter," she had insisted when Mr. Graves arrived. "I see no reason for outsiders to be present." "Miss Marple has been most kind during my illness," Beatrice had replied with uncharacteristic firmness. "I wish her to stay." Agatha, outvoted, had subsided into rigid silence, her back straight as a ramrod in her chair by the fireplace. Dr. Henderson was also present, ostensibly to monitor Beatrice's condition, though Miss Marple had observed his professional interest in the proceedings. Mr. Graves adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat. "This document appears to be properly executed," he announced, examining the will Miss Marple had surrendered to him upon his arrival. "The witnesses' signatures are those of my clerk and my secretary. It is, without doubt, the missing will." "And the contents?" demanded Agatha, her voice taut with suppressed emotion. "Miss Cecilia has left the bulk of her estate to Miss Eleanor Blackwood," replied the solicitor, glancing up from the document, "with a small annuity to Miss Beatrice and certain personal items divided between you both." "Eleanor Blackwood?" Agatha's voice was ice. "Who is this person? I've never heard the name." "I have taken the liberty of contacting Miss Blackwood at the address provided in the will," continued Mr. Graves, unmoved by Agatha's reaction. "She will arrive this afternoon to discuss the inheritance." "This is preposterous," declared Agatha, rising to her feet. "Some unknown woman inheriting what rightfully belongs to the family. The will must be contested. Cecilia was clearly not in her right mind." "I'm afraid the document is quite clear and legally sound," replied Mr. Graves. "Miss Cecilia was of sound mind when she visited my office, and her instructions were most explicit." "Did she explain her connection to this Miss Blackwood?" inquired Dr. Henderson gently. The solicitor hesitated. "She indicated that it was a private matter of long standing. I did not press for details." Beatrice, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, suddenly spoke. "Agatha, we must accept Cecilia's wishes. She had her reasons." "Reasons?" Agatha turned to her sister, her face flushed with anger. What possible reason could justify disinheriting her own family in favour of a stranger? "Perhaps Miss Blackwood is not quite a stranger," suggested Miss Marple quietly. All eyes turned to her, and she continued with an air of gentle apology. "I couldn't help but notice the surname. The gentleman in the photograph, Mr. Edward Blackwood, was he perhaps related to this Eleanor?" A heavy silence fell over the room. Agatha's expression hardened as she turned to Beatrice. "You knew," she said, her voice dangerously low. "You knew about this person?" Beatrice met her gaze steadily. "I suspected. Cecilia confided in me shortly before she died." "And you said nothing?" Agatha's hands clenched at her sides. "After everything we've sacrificed to maintain this family's standing, to protect our name, you would allow this?" "It was Cecilia's right," replied Beatrice, her voice strengthening despite her physical weakness. "Her fortune to leave as she wished." The tense exchange was interrupted by Martha announcing luncheon. As they moved to the dining room, Miss Marple observed the rigid set of Agatha's shoulders, the concerned glances Dr. Henderson directed toward Beatrice, and the air of dignified resignation that surrounded Mr. Graves. Eleanor Blackwood arrived at precisely 3 o'clock that afternoon. Miss Marple, who had returned to the inn after lunch, accompanied Mrs. Bantry back to Hillcrest for what her friend described as the most interesting development Thornwick has seen in decades. The young woman who stepped into the drawing room caused a momentary hush to fall over the assembled company. Of medium height and graceful carriage, she possessed a quiet self-possession that commanded attention without demanding it. But it was her features that drew Miss Marple's careful scrutiny, the distinctive curve of her brow, the set of her eyes, so strikingly reminiscent of the portrait in the library. "Miss Blackwood," said Mr. Graves, performing the introductions. "May I present Miss Agatha Thorndyke and Miss Beatrice Thorndyke, sisters of the late Miss Cecilia." "I'm very pleased to meet you," said Eleanor, her voice cultured and composed. "Though I regret the circumstances." "Indeed," replied Agatha coldly. "We find the circumstances most regrettable ourselves." Mr. Graves hastily introduced the others, Dr. Henderson, Mrs. Bantry, and Miss Marple, before suggesting they all be seated. Martha brought in tea, and for several minutes the conversation remained painfully stilted, confined to observations about the journey and the weather. "You must be wondering about my connection to your sister," said Eleanor finally, addressing both Thorndykes, though her gaze rested more gently on Beatrice. "I think we can guess," said Agatha bitterly. "The resemblance is unmistakable." "Yes," agreed Eleanor without embarrassment. "I believe I take after my father in many respects, though I never knew him. My mother spoke of him often, however." "And your mother was?" inquired Agatha, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Mary Harrington. She was a governess in London when they met." Eleanor set down her teacup. "She told me they had been deeply in love, but that his family situation was complicated. He had prior obligations he couldn't honourably break." "How convenient," murmured Agatha. "Miss Blackwood," interjected Miss Marple gently, "might I ask how you came to be in contact with Miss Cecilia?" Eleanor turned to her with a grateful smile. "My mother passed away last year. Among her papers I found letters from Miss Thorndyke, from Cecilia, dating back many years. It seems they had corresponded secretly since shortly after my birth. When I wrote to inform her of Mother's passing, she invited me to visit." "And you came," said Beatrice softly. "I remember now. You were the visitor that day in April." Eleanor nodded. "She told me everything then, about my father, about their relationship, about the circumstances that kept them apart. She said she had monitored my life from a distance, though she respected my mother's wish that I not be told until I was grown." "A charming story," said Agatha, her voice laden with sarcasm. "And naturally, she decided to leave you her fortune." "I tried to refuse," replied Eleanor with dignity. "I have a modest income of my own, and no need for wealth. But she insisted it was her right, indeed her duty, to provide for me as my father would have wished." Something in her phrasing caught Miss Marple's attention. Before she could pursue it, however, Beatrice suffered another coughing fit. Dr. Henderson moved swiftly to her side and, after a brief examination, insisted she return to bed. "Will you stay at Hillcrest, Miss Blackwood?" inquired Mrs. Bantry, as the gathering prepared to disperse. "There's room at the inn if you prefer." "Miss Blackwood is welcome to stay here," said Beatrice firmly, leaning on the doctor's arm. "It was Cecilia's wish, and I concur." Agatha said nothing, but her expression as she watched Eleanor, a mixture of hostility and something deeper, more complex, reminded Miss Marple forcibly of old Mrs. Ellington when confronted with evidence of her past indiscretions. It was the look of someone seeing a ghost made flesh, a reminder of sins believed long buried. Chapter 7. Patterns of the Past. The atmosphere at Hillcrest Manor grew increasingly strained with Eleanor Blackwood's continued presence. Miss Marple, calling to visit Beatrice the following morning, found the middle Thorndyke sister noticeably weaker, her breathing laboured, and her complexion alarmingly grey. "I'm afraid she had a difficult night," murmured Dr. Henderson, drawing Miss Marple aside in the corridor. "The specialist from London should arrive this afternoon, but I confess I'm deeply concerned." "The symptoms are worsening?" inquired Miss Marple. "Rapidly. There's a similarity to Cecilia's final decline that I find troubling." The doctor hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "I've taken the liberty of securing samples for analysis." "Miss Marple, you may recall my earlier reservations about the circumstances of Cecilia's death." Before Miss Marple could respond, Martha approached to inform them that Beatrice was asking for Miss Marple specifically. "She's been most insistent, miss," added the maid, even when Miss Agatha suggested she rest undisturbed. The sick room was dimly lit, heavy curtains drawn against the morning sunlight. Beatrice lay propped against several pillows, her breathing shallow, but her eyes alert. She gestured weakly for Miss Marple to approach. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. "There isn't much time." "Now, my dear, you mustn't talk that way," said Miss Marple, taking a seat beside the bed. "Dr. Henderson has called for a specialist." "Too late for specialists." Beatrice's voice strengthened momentarily. "Miss Marple, I need to speak with you privately about Cecilia and about Eleanor." "Of course. What is it you wish to tell me?" Beatrice glanced anxiously toward the door. "Agatha mustn't know we've spoken. She's watching me carefully. Miss Marple, do you believe in heredity? The way certain features, certain tendencies pass from one generation to the next?" "I've certainly observed family resemblances," replied Miss Marple carefully. "Eleanor has her father's eyes, and Cecilia's smile." Beatrice's gaze grew distant. "We all loved Edward, you know, all three sisters, but he loved only Cecilia. Agatha never forgave either of them for that." "Was there an understanding between them, between Edward and Cecilia?" "More than an understanding. They planned to marry." Beatrice's voice dropped to a whisper. "But father discovered their secret meetings. There was a terrible confrontation. Edward was sent away, and we were told never to mention his name again." She closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength. Cecilia was already with child, though none of us knew it then. She was sent to visit an aunt in London, ostensibly for the season, but actually to hide her condition. The baby was given up for adoption.
"Eleanor,"
murmured Miss Marple. Yes, but that wasn't the end. Beatrice's hand moved restlessly on the coverlet. Cecilia never stopped loving Edward, and Agatha never stopped hating him or her for what she saw as a betrayal. Miss Marple, I need to show you something. In my prayer book on the dressing table. Miss Marple retrieved the worn leather volume and brought it to Beatrice, who fumbled with trembling fingers at a page marked with a faded ribbon. From between the leaves, she extracted a yellowed photograph showing a much younger Edward Blackwood with Cecilia, their heads close together, their expressions conveying unmistakable happiness. "Turn it over," whispered Beatrice. On the back, in faded ink, was written, "To my dearest B, guard our secret and the promise we must keep. With eternal gratitude, C." "This was taken shortly before Eleanor was born," explained Beatrice. "Cecilia entrusted it to me, knowing I would keep it safe from Agatha." "And the promise you were to keep," prompted Miss Marple gently. "To ensure that Eleanor would someday know the truth about her parentage, and that she would receive what was rightfully hers." Beatrice's voice faltered. "I've kept a diary, Miss Marple. Everything is recorded there. The letters Cecilia received from Mary Harrington over the years, the visits Eleanor made to Cecilia in London when she was older." "Where is this diary now?" "Hidden in my needlework box, the false bottom." Beatrice's breathing became more laboured. "You must find it before Agatha does. She's been searching. She knows, I suspect." The door opened abruptly and Agatha entered, her expression hardening at the sight of Miss Marple seated so close to her sister. "Beatrice needs rest," she said sharply. "The doctor was most explicit." "Of course," agreed Miss Marple, rising. "I was just leaving." "Wait," gasped Beatrice, clutching at Miss Marple's hand. "Come back this evening. I need to tell you." "That's quite enough," interrupted Agatha. "You're overexciting yourself, Beatrice. Your health must be our primary concern now." As Miss Marple reluctantly took her leave, she glanced back to see Agatha standing rigidly by the bed, watching her sister with an expression that combined concern with something harder, more calculating. Returning to the inn for luncheon, Miss Marple found Mrs. Bantry full of village gossip about the mysterious London visitor and her connection to the Thorndyke family. "The most extraordinary theories are circulating," she declared. "Mrs. Pringle at the shop is convinced the young woman must be a fraud, while Reverend Hadley's wife insists there's a marked family resemblance. What do you make of it all, Jane?" "It reminds me somewhat of a case in St. Mary Mead," replied Miss Marple thoughtfully. "Old Mrs. Wilkins discovered her late husband had fathered a child with their former housemaid. The resemblance, when the young man appeared, was quite unmistakable." "And was there a terrible scene? Did Mrs. Wilkins refuse to acknowledge him?" "On the contrary. She welcomed him into her home and altered her will in his favour." Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically. It was her sister who objected most strenuously. She had always expected to inherit the Wilkins property, you see, and the appearance of this new heir threatened her expectations. "Jealousy is such a destructive emotion," observed Mrs. Bantry. "Particularly when it has festered for decades," agreed Miss Marple. In that case, the sister's resentment had poisoned her mind to such an extent that she was prepared to take desperate measures. That evening, Miss Marple returned to Hillcrest Manor, only to be informed by a distraught Martha that Beatrice had suffered a severe attack shortly after luncheon and had fallen into a coma. Dr. Henderson and the specialist from London were in attendance, but the prognosis was grave. "She asked for you repeatedly before she lost consciousness," Martha confided, wiping her eyes with her apron. but Miss Agatha wouldn't hear of sending for anyone. "Is Miss Thorndyke in her sister's room now?" inquired Miss Marple. "No, miss. She's gone to lie down with a headache. The strain, you know." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Perhaps I might just look in on poor Miss Beatrice." "I promise not to disturb the doctors." Once admitted to the sick room, Miss Marple exchanged quiet words with Dr. Henderson, whose grave expression confirmed her worst fears. When the doctors stepped out briefly to confer in the corridor, she took the opportunity to examine the needlework box on Beatrice's dressing table. The false bottom was cleverly constructed, but yielded to Miss Marple's practised fingers. Within lay a small, leather-bound diary, its pages filled with Beatrice's neat handwriting. Quickly securing it in her handbag, Miss Marple was preparing to leave when she noticed a slip of paper that had fallen to the floor, a laboratory report addressed to Dr. Henderson, with certain compounds underlined in red ink. Chapter 8. The Truth Inherits. The following evening found an unusual gathering assembled in the drawing-room at Hillcrest Manor. Dr. Henderson had arranged it at Miss Marple's request, explaining to Agatha that certain matters regarding her sister's estates required immediate attention. In addition to Agatha and Eleanor, Mrs. Bantry, Mr. Graves, and Inspector Morton from the county police were present. "I fail to see why all this is necessary," Agatha remarked coldly, her tall figure rigid with disapproval as she stood by the fireplace. "My sister's condition is critical. This hardly seems the time for legal discussions." "I'm afraid it cannot wait, Miss Thorndyke," said Dr. Henderson gravely. "Miss Marple has information that bears directly on both your sister's illnesses." All eyes turned to Miss Marple, who sat quietly with her knitting, the picture of an unassuming elderly lady. She looked up with a slightly apologetic smile. "It's all rather distressing, I'm afraid," she began, her needles continuing their rhythmic movement. "But certain patterns have become apparent that cannot be ignored. You see, I've been reminded throughout this sad affair of a case in St. Mary Mead some years ago. 3 sisters, much like the Thorndykes, whose affections became entangled with the same gentleman." "Really, Miss Marple," interrupted Agatha sharply, "is this village gossip relevant to my sister's condition?" "Most relevant," replied Miss Marple, unperturbed. "In both cases, jealousy festered for decades, eventually leading to tragedy. The human heart doesn't readily relinquish its grievances, you see." Eleanor Blackwood leaned forward slightly. "You believe my aunt's death and my mother's illness were not natural?" "Your mother?" echoed Agatha, her voice tight with anger. "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "Cecilia Thorndyke was indeed Eleanor's mother, as Beatrice confirmed to me yesterday, a fact you've known since Eleanor's visit in April, Miss Thorndyke, though you've refused to acknowledge it openly." "This is absurd," declared Agatha. "You have no proof of these outlandish claims." "On the contrary," said Inspector Morton, speaking for the first time, "Dr. Henderson has provided substantial evidence. The laboratory report confirms the presence of arsenic in samples taken from both Miss Cecilia and Miss Beatrice." "Arsenic?" gasped Mrs. Bantry. "But how?" "The roses," said Miss Marple quietly. "Miss Agatha is an avid gardener, particularly proud of her roses. The arsenic compound used to treat black spot on roses can be quite lethal when administered in tea over a period of time. The symptoms mimic certain types of heart failure, especially in elderly patients. Beatrice began to suspect after Cecilia's death, particularly when she observed her sister disposing of Cecilia's personal correspondence." "This is outrageous," protested Agatha, though her complexion had grown noticeably paler. "Beatrice kept a detailed diary," continued Miss Marple, removing the small leather volume from her handbag. "She recorded her growing suspicions, particularly after discovering that Cecilia had made contact with Eleanor. The final entry dated just 3 days ago, states her belief that you poisoned Cecilia upon learning of Eleanor's existence and her claim to inheritance." "A claim based on what?" demanded Agatha. "The deluded ramblings of a sick woman." Mr. Graves cleared his throat. "Actually, there is further documentation. When examining Miss Cecilia's legal papers, I discovered correspondence dating back over 20 years with Mrs. Mary Harrington, Eleanor's adoptive mother. The letters establish beyond doubt the parentage of Miss Blackwood." "And Beatrice knew this?" added Miss Marple. "She knew that Cecilia had maintained contact with her daughter through Mary Harrington, and that she intended to bring Eleanor back into the family. When you discovered this, Miss Thorndyke, it threatened everything you had sacrificed for the family name, the estate, the respectability you had maintained at such cost." "You cannot possibly understand," said Agatha, her voice suddenly altered, lower, and filled with a lifetime of bitterness. "The scandal would have ruined us. Father made us promise, all of us, never to speak of it again. I kept that promise. I protected this family for decades, while Cecilia secretly defied us all. And when Eleanor appeared, the physical proof of that defiance, you decided Cecilia must be silenced permanently," said Inspector Morton. "And later, when Beatrice began to suspect, you administered the same treatment to her." "She was going to tell everyone," whispered Agatha, her composure cracking. "After all these years of sacrifice, of watching over this house, maintaining our position, she was going to throw it all away for that woman's child." Eleanor had remained silent throughout this exchange, her face pale but composed. Now she spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "They were in love, weren't they?" "My parents? That wasn't a crime." "Love?" Agatha's laugh was harsh. "Edward Blackwood was a fortune hunter who turned to Cecilia when I refused him. I saw through his charm, his false promises. Father agreed with me, that's why he was sent away. But Cecilia always defied us, always did exactly as she pleased, regardless of the consequences." "And you never forgave her for being chosen when you were not," said Miss Marple softly. "Just as in the case of the Wilkins sisters, jealousy hardened into hatred over the years." "Miss Thorndyke," said Inspector Morton formally, "I must ask you to accompany me to the station. There are serious questions you must answer regarding your sister's illnesses." As Agatha was led from the room, her proud bearing finally broken, Eleanor turned to Miss Marple. "How did you know?" "About the music box, about all of it." "It reminded me of something quite similar in St. Mary Mead," replied Miss Marple, carefully placing her knitting in her bag. "People are remarkably alike everywhere, you know. Human nature follows certain patterns: jealousy, love, the desire to protect family secrets." Beatrice understood this. That's why she ensured the will would be found, why she documented her suspicions even as she herself became a victim. Later that evening, as Miss Marple prepared to return to St. Mary Mead, Dr. Henderson brought news that Beatrice Thorndyke had passed away peacefully in her sleep. "She held on just long enough," observed Miss Marple, gazing up at the darkened windows of Hillcrest Manor. "Just long enough to ensure that the truth would inherit everything, not just the estate, but the full story of what happened all those years ago." "A strange legacy," murmured Mrs. Bantry, who had come to see her friend off at the station. "Perhaps," agreed Miss Marple, "but truth often is. Eleanor will rebuild her life knowing who she truly is and where she comes from. That, I believe, is what Cecilia and Beatrice both wanted for her: freedom from the shadows of the past." The train pulled into the station, steam billowing in the evening air. As Miss Marple settled into her compartment for the journey home, she reflected that the pattern of human nature, once recognized, was remarkably constant. From St. Mary Mead to Thornwick, from the grandest manor house to the humblest cottage, the fundamental truths remained unchanged: love and hatred, jealousy and forgiveness, the desperate lengths to which people would go to preserve their secrets, and the inevitable way those secrets, like truth itself, eventually found their rightful inheritance. Thanks for joining us for The House of Three Widows. Did you suspect Agatha Thorndyke was behind the poisonings before Miss Marple revealed her as the jealous sister consumed by decades of resentment? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this adventure with Miss Marple, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, remember Miss Marple's wisdom. Human nature follows the same patterns everywhere, and understanding those patterns is the key to uncovering even the most carefully hidden truths. This is Alfie signing off from Cafe Stories.